tell me a bit about where you grew up in England?
Yeah, I grew up in a small town in the west of England called Gloucestershire, or called Gloucester. The county is Gloucestershire, and it's next to Wales, and it's kind of small town place. They all sound like, I don't know if you've seen the movie Hot Fuzz, that was quite big about 10 years ago, but they've all got this really country kind of accent. They talk like that there. It's really country. And it's a really lovely place because it's there's a lot of countryside, a lot of agriculture, about 2 hours west of London. That's where I grew up.
That's wonderful. So it was quite like countryside, rural, not too big of a city where you grew up.
Yeah, so I grew up in the city, so I wasn't on a farm or anything, but it's a small city. So at one side we've got a place called the Cotswolds, which is like fields and hills and lovely like cliffs, and then the other side we've got the Forest of Dean, which is like, for British standard a big forest, but for American standard a small forest. Yeah, it was nice to have a bit of the city life, but also to be able to get out easily into nature as well, and that love of nature really, really big part of me. So
yeah, absolutely, that sounds like a good mix. Can you tell me about how you first started gravitating towards writing in school?
Yeah, so I think I wrote my first poem when I was about 13 or 14. So at first it was really through music initially. So I was listening to a lot of punk music and a lot of rap music, and started initially, when I was actually child, when I was 12 or 11, I was writing little rap songs. And then later on I was playing bass and writing the lyrics for a punk band I was in. And that's really where it started. At the same time I got into more folk music, so Bob Dylan was a huge influence on me as a teenager, in terms of I think he's a huge influence on so many people, but in terms of that, blurring that line between poetry and lyrics and song lyrics. And while I was listening to Bob Dylan and writing these songs for this punk band, like a lot of political songs, protest sort of songs, I started getting through Bob Dylan, into some of the poetry written by some of the civil rights activists in the States. And then really, my brother bought me, at the age of 16, the complete works of Langston Hughes, which was like, just blew me away, like what he could do, the power that he could have in his poetry for social change. And if I go through, because I've typed up every single poem I've ever written on files on my computer, and if I go through, I can kind of pinpoint when I started reading that, because what I was writing immediately got a lot more mature, because of kind of reading something which I connected with so deeply. And then I was getting into other poets who were writing in the UK, like Benjamin Zephaniah, and it was a lot of political poets, initially through music, and then through some of these political poets and freedom poets. And then it just kind of developed from there. I started writing without any songs, to put the words to, and kind of, just snowballed from there, really, yeah.
That was a great response. You kind of answered my next 3 questions.
Okay, sorry.
Which is awesome. No, I'm totally the same way. I feel like a lot of writers really influence me too. So reading is kind of the best way for me to be able to write. I'd like to go back to how music's first influenced your poetry writing. So you said you were in a band? Yeah,
I was in a couple of bands during my teenage years. So I played bass, and I was also writing I bought, as soon as I started getting into Bob Dylan, I started playing guitar and bought the harness for the harmonica and stuff and started doing all that thing. So I was writing songs for myself and initially the first band I was in, I wasn't singing, I was just playing bass, but I was writing all of the lyrics, and then got into another band, and I was kind of being the front man, which is not really me. I prefer kind of sitting back and like playing bass and not being in the limelight. But because it was lyrics that were, it was always lyrics I emotionally kind of connected with and came from somewhere really important. When the music started, I kind of had that kind of connection through the words and the music, and was able to kind of be a bit more outgoing on stage. But then when the music stopped, I was like, I never knew what to say. So yeah, and I was writing the punk music. It was kind of like post hardcore kind of punk. So it wasn't that melodic. So it was kind of like chanted poetry, almost like slam poetry with heavy guitars kind of music. So it was kind of an easy transition from that to writing without any music at all.
Yeah, that sounds great. And then you kind of were influenced by poets who are writing more about political movements and civil movements. So can you tell me more about the collection of Langston Hughes poems that influenced you?
Yeah. So it was kind of crazy because it sometimes throughout when I've read something new since then, I've realized that I've connected to a poem, and then I've realized that actually it was read to me when I was young. So my parents are both into literature in different ways, and we had this book of, I don't even know if it's still at home with my parents or whatever, but we had this book of varied poems, and there was a poem that my dad had read to me when I was little, and it was like about building a road. And it was like, hey, I'm building a road, look at me, I'm building a road. And it's a Langston Hughes poem. So I found it in this book. I was reading this book, I was like, it's just connected with me, and it just brought back all these memories of my childhood. And like, I had no idea about kind of the chain gang situation of Black people in the States when I was little reading it. And then I was reading it as a teenager, kind of understanding more of the historical context and just having a whole nother layer of meaning kind of brought to me. But the thing is with Langston Hughes that I found, it was just, he was able to write so simply and so powerfully at the same time. And that's why I didn't, now later on I got into kind of a lot of the more classical poetry and, you know, formal writing and all of that kind of stuff. But for a teenager, that for me as a teenager at least, that seemed very pretentious. You know, a lot of the stuff that I might read now as well, kind of Shakespeare and things. I couldn't connect to Shakespeare as a kid. But Langston Hughes, the simplicity of the words he chose and the concrete nature of the images just kind of knocked me sideways every time. So
yeah, I can definitely see his influence, I think, in a lot of your work as well, just the simplicity of images. And I think that's also my favorite type of poetry. Cool. Because I think I like things that are more up for interpretation as well, that aren't like so in your face. And I think that's kind of what poetry can offer more than maybe prose can, because I think prose should be direct and concise, but poetry I think allows a lot for reader interpretation.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that's one of the beautiful things about a poem. It's like you say a word that has two meanings, and it can mean both at the same time in poetry. You know, like I'm trying to think of an example, but
well, in your poem, I think you use the word pupils, and that can mean pupils as in students, or pupils as in eyeballs. I totally thought it was eyes, but it totally makes sense for it to be students.
It was both, because it's like, in that's actually a good example, like because it was meant to be both, because the pupils are the students in front of the art students, but also it's their focused pupils. So it's that kind of depth of meaning that you can have with poetry, both at once, both and. It's a good example.
Definitely. As a writer, I'm super interested in structure, kind of the opening of a piece, the arc, and what feels important enough to leave in. How do you begin to structure your poems?
Up until like 3 years ago, I basically wrote exclusively free verse poetry. And then I started messing around with form and writing a lot of sonnets and a couple of villanelles here and there, and using more meter. And what I found with writing a free verse poetry, a lot of that form, a lot of the structure of the poetry, kind of comes in through the editing, and it's a lot more raw, the writing kind of process for me. Like I just kind of would get the pen and just like go, and whatever happened comes out then. So I write everything in my notepad, and then it's the typing it up onto the computer is where it kind of takes that shape. And it's when I notice kind of the strongest image in the poem is during that typing up process. And then that's when I'll kind of like, if there's too many images, then I'll be like, okay, what's the actual central image here, and do the supporting images actually help it, or do they just detract from it? And then I'll either cut, or I'll try and switch an image around so it kind of supports that kind of central image or metaphor, and kind of allow kind of the sound and the phonetic sound of the words to shape the poem as well. Whereas with a sonnet, for example, because you've got 14 lines, and if you're writing, one with a rhyming couplet, you kind of have this thing that a rhyming couplet at the end, for example, you've kind of got this thing you're going towards, you've just got this limited amount of space. And I found that was actually a freeing kind of limitation, in that like you're not gonna just keep going on and write this really kind of self-involved kind of piece that goes on and on and on, but it's just like you have to be concise, and you've got this meter to think about, and but the freedom that you can have within such tight restrictions is really I found it really refreshing after so many years of writing free verse. So now I probably write about 50-50 formal and free verse poetry, and it's still pretty much the same. Like I think a lot more before writing when I'm writing a formal poem, but the editing is so much more creative for the free verse poems.
Yeah, I feel the same way about how structure can be freeing at the same time, because once you kind of know the parameters of what you need to write and what you need to make your writing fit, then I think you can explore a lot more structure. But exactly. It's also super fascinating to hear that you first kind of write your poems, by hand, and then once you transfer it onto a computer, that is also how you edit. Yeah, that's fascinating to me, because usually what I write is longer, so I don't first go in and write it by hand. Do you think there's utility in doing it first by hand and then transferring it onto a computer?
I think it depends on what you're writing and also your own habits. So for me, it's what I've always done. Ever since I was writing, usually when I was at school writing these songs, I was on the bus. So didn't really have it was kind of before phones that we have now and iPads and that kind of stuff. And I'd be just writing in a notebook on the bus. And then when I was transferring it to songs, I had to type it up so that I could kind of print it out for the singers and whatnot, because my handwriting's terrible. So, and sometimes if I'm writing late at night, for example, I get my notepad and I look at it in the morning, I'll just be like, what does that word say? And it's so frustrating, because I'm sure it seemed good when I wrote it last night. But yeah, I think if you're writing something short, it can be really, really helpful. But it's really easy to let the page kind of restrict you, because I find like when I've had a bigger notebook, I write longer poems, and when I have a shorter notebook, I write kind of smaller poems, because that page restriction, it's almost like limiting yourself to a sonnet, or to a certain length, like a certain form. It's like you've got this page, and if you go over to the next page, then it's kind of like you're kind of free to kind of keep going. And if I go over one page, then I could do like 4 or 5, but a lot of the time I just, it kind of rounds itself off when I get to that end of that page. So it's interesting. I think it really does depend on what you're writing though, and also your own habits.
Yeah, that makes sense. Having that physical boundary, super fascinating, because I feel like online it's so easy to go, to the next page, but actually having like the end of the notebook cut you off.
Yeah, it's really weird, and it's not it took a while for me to realize that that was happening. It wasn't a conscious thing. And it was when I was I usually had like small notebooks like this, and then I had a bigger one, and then I went back to a smaller one, and then I realized I was just kind of getting to the end of the page and squeezing extra lines in at the bottom. I was like, what like I can just go to the next page. But it is interesting having that concrete kind of thing, and the poetry that we create is an interaction, not just between our minds, but it is a physical interaction with what we're writing with as well. Like that does influence it. So it's fascinating, isn't it?
Right. That kind of reminds me of another question I had. Do you write for the eye or do you write for the ear? It's kind of a big question.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've written, usually I write for the ear, and I read out loud. That's also part of the editing. When I'm writing, typing it up, and when I'm kind of writing initially, I'll kind of read each line out loud, or at least like out loud in my head, if that makes sense. And try and hear the sound of the words, because poem really comes to life when it's being read and those sounds are coming. But also I've written some kind of one or two concrete poems and one or two poems with a bit more shape on the page, you know. So it really does depend, but even if it is concrete or there is that sort of shape, I'm still writing with the ear in mind. I'm still kind of reading it out loud, kind of repeatedly reading it out loud if I'm editing.
Yeah, no, I definitely do the same. I'm always reading aloud my work. It's quite a nuisance to my roommates. I'd like to talk a bit about To My Son at 3 Days specifically now.
Absolutely.
Can you tell me about when you started writing this poem on day 3?
Oof. The memory I have of the poem is kind of contained in the poem, because that's the most concrete thing. That's kind of, everything becomes like a blur, because you're really not sleeping very much. But I think I can remember the first idea. I think the actual first image that came to me was the last one, actually, because I think I was lying down and he was just lying on me. This kind of realization that, like, you know, that we all live within the universe, but like every one of us has our own perspective on the universe, and every single one of those is unique. And there's this little being, you know, being able to perceive everything around us, like born, and the entire universe, his perception of the entire universe contained in his tiny soft little skull, you know. And he was lying there, like literally between my chin and my belly button. I was just like overwhelmed with that, and it just spilled out from that image. And that's kind of where the poem was kind of leading to, because I started with that final image.
Super fascinating. Is there a reason why you decided to put it at the end versus at the beginning?
I was just trying to, maybe it's the image of him kind of lying between my chin and my belly button is like, it's his whole being. And I think I wanted to kind of go through some specifics first, you know, like that was maybe the thing that started it. And then I started looking at some of the specific things and feeling my feelings about what it is to be there, to be the father of this beautiful little boy. And then just to kind of go through some of these specifics, and then kind of, you know, talk about him as a whole.
To kind of lead up to it, I guess. I mean, so many beautiful lines in here.
Thank you.
One of my favorite lines, I think, has to be these few, if you'll allow me to read a few lines.
Absolutely, that's very nice.
You fill my vision as I put my forehead to yours, so close your features blur, so close that you might be able to make out mine, with your fresh eyes adjusting to the light and the cold. I mean, that's just really visual. So can you tell me about how those lines came to be?
It's one of those things that you kind of hear, like newborn babies can't see very clearly when you're far away, and it's like initially apparently it's just a few inches from the face they can see. And I was like, you know, I just wanted him to be able to kind of already know me kind of thing. So like always keeping my face as close as I could to his, but then realizing that, like, you know, always having to go back out so I could make out his new face, you know, and kind of like realizing there's that juxtaposition of like his I'm blurry for him, and then like he's blurry for me when I go close. And then just thinking about, you know, how he's been nice and warm inside the womb for 9 months, and now is kind of that adjustment, and the eyes are some of the most vulnerable parts of the body for that, you know. And so it's just kind of, they've got to they've not been able to see. They've been warm inside the fluid and whatever, and now they're out in the world, and you step out into a winter's day and your eyes sting because of the cold. So I was just thinking about him. He was born in December as well, so it's just kind of that theme of stepping out into the cold.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the next few lines that are my favorite: you fill my heart with electricity and fear that your potential might be stifled by me not reaching mine. I do not have children, but I still feel that way with kind of loved ones around me, that I have my role to play in their lives as well, and to make sure that we're supportive of each other and reaching our potential. Can you talk about how these lines came to be for you?
Yeah, I had this kind of mantra going through my head while we were waiting for him to be born. Almost, it was kind of like, he's now going to be the protagonist of your kind of life story. It's like that. It was like, when he's born, you're no longer the protagonist. If you think of your film, your life like a movie or a novel, you could be the main character in your own kind of head, but then all of a sudden it's like there's this new life that you have to look after and you have to look out for, and I mean, we have to be careful not to allow, not to kind of smother our loved ones or our children, and not to put all of our hope and things on them and let them be themselves, but at the same time it's like that there's that terrified awe, of like, there's this life, and like, I'm his dad, and I've got to be a good one. I've got to be good because I don't want to mess it up for him. It's not an unhealthy fear, it's just like, I think that the old-fashioned use of the word awe is kind of what birthed those lines, because it's that constant feeling of like overwhelmed, being overwhelmed with it, and with the responsibility of bringing him up and making him feel loved. Yeah.
From my perspective, I think that's a very healthy fear to have.
I agree.
Is there anything else you wanted, or I guess what is the takeaway, I guess, for what you want readers to walk away with after reading this poem?
I think I would be really happy if they could walk away and with a kind of marvel for new life, and that's where the poem came from. It's like marveling at the miracle of life, and it's so much easier for us to marvel at life when we have a newborn child in front of us. They're so delicate and so innocent and all of that. But I before living where I live now, I lived in London and worked with the homeless, and if you think about a newborn child, and then you think of a homeless person on the street, and you think like, when did it happen that this life stopped being treated like they were precious and unique? And we're not that, in terms of the universe, we're not that much bigger than a newborn child. He can lie between my chin and my belly button. He's a bit bigger than that now, but we all have that unique perspective of the universe. And if people kind of walk away with that marvel for life and that sense that life is precious, then I will be extremely happy.
Yeah, I think us at the Archetype are definitely walking away with that. So
that's really sweet.
A Man Without a Mirror is so good because it's so up for interpretation. Can you tell me a bit about the origin of that poem?
Yeah, thank you. That's really nice of you to say. The origin was kind of a mixture of two things. So like I just mentioned, I was working with the homeless before I came down to live in France, and my brother also was doing a degree in fine art, and he would talk about some of the life drawing classes he would have, and how like it's often usually people who just didn't care. They're not modeling to be kind of looked at and have photos taken and be like all glamorous. They're just there to be a raw human form kind of in front of people. And he said often like there was someone with like a glazed look, and they were just like, it's like they're just sitting on their sofa, but they're just got no clothes on, and everyone's drawing them. And I was like, man, like I just, it would be strange to have, to be like that and to be looked at by a bunch of art students and like, being drawn. But there was something in that disinterested look that kind of, that hit me, especially when like the word model is usually used for kind of someone who has to be overly aware of how they look, to their job. And at the same time, I was working with the homeless, and we'd catch that same look on some of the people I was working with, where they didn't care, how they were looking, they weren't just about to take a selfie, but they would say really profound things and really have really deep, interesting conversations. Some would talk with such bold confidence. It's just like, I was like thinking, why do we always need to be so like aware and so self-aware of like what we look like and what we're wearing, and aware of like if ever we catch our reflection in a mirror or even a window, it's just like, oh, I have to check whether our hair's right. And like, that was kind of what inspired it. It's not definitely not inspired by myself, because if I like a lot of people, I'm as can be as vain as anyone else.
Yeah. Me as well. And I think the last two lines really capture that feeling. I'm just going to read the last three lines here. Of the social media cameras that keep the rest of us glancing at mirrors. I've been having a lot of conversations about social media, I think, with my friends. Do you think social media has exacerbated this issue of us constantly thinking about our appearance or our perception of other people?
Yeah, I think it has in a couple of ways. I think it's social media and the other technologies around social media, because not only do we have social media that is where we kind of broadcast, because it's media where we broadcast our social life and especially with pictures, but we've also had like development of technologies of more and more devices that take photos of ourselves, and we've pretty much always in front of some sort of camera, whether it's on our phone, on a TV, on a computer, or on a tablet, and I think that it's that mixed with social media and mixed with certain elements of celebrity culture mean that there is that kind of constant self-awareness of how we look, and it being like the most important thing as well. So yeah, I think it has.
Same question for this poem. Is there a takeaway you want readers to have after reading this?
Yeah, it's kind of you're worth listening to. Like, even if you're having a bad hair day, or even if like you don't need to look in the mirror to be worth listening to be worth looking at, or to be worth drawing, and someone spending hours of time drawing a beautiful picture of what you look like. It's not in covering up your natural self with whatever, but it's actually you're worth looking at, you're worth listening to, you're worth whatever you feel gives you meaning, without having to obsess over if everything's perfect.
Right. I love that. Can you tell me about how you ended up in France?
Yeah. So I studied theology in London, and after studying, I met Celia there, and she grew up down here in the south of France, and one of the she lived in England for 3 years by the time I met her, and one of the things she said was, we spent a long time getting to know each other before starting to go out together. And one of the things she said to me when we were still friends was like, I can't stay in the UK. Like, I hate the weather. It was mainly the weather, but she also really wanted to be closer to her parents. And it was really important for her that I learned French. And for me, I've always kind of loved the idea of travel before. I never had much opportunity to travel before meeting Celia, but she's kind of someone who's been all around the world, lived in so many different countries, and so I was like, yeah, let's do it. Let's go to France. So after we met, we started going out, and then made that commitment. So we got married and moved down to France, and I spent a lot of time kind of trying to learn French, and I was working in a smoothie bar for a while here, kind of in order to be really immersed. And now I'm teaching English online, and that was one of the things that I didn't want to do initially, because I wanted to really focus on learning French. And if I'm working in English, I was like, I'm never going to do it. But through her patience and teaching, because she's amazing with languages, she speaks a lot. She speaks like 5 languages. With her patience and teaching, and her mum, who is brilliant in English as well, but her dad, who doesn't speak any English, so I had like a really good place to learn as well, because there's the obligation to learn as well as having people to kind of listen and explain things to me. So I was in such a good position to learn. So through all that, I got good enough to be able to work in English as well. So that's good. But yeah, it was basically to come down here and learn to speak French, and to be where we're right near where Celia grew up. So
yeah, sounds like you had a lot of good teachers. French, and that helped you kind of integrate yourself. Do your surroundings influence your work at all?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, definitely. So I mentioned before that, like, place, nature. I said about kind of my growing up in Gloucestershire and nature being really important to me, and that's kind of remained the case. So I kind of write about kind of two main kind of concrete things, either people or place normally, but also there's that's normally to kind of express other ideas, because I'm really interested in philosophy and theology and things, so a lot of these ideas come out in the writing, but concretely it's usually always about really about the place I'm in, or about the people I'm with or surrounded by or have encountered. So I've written a lot of poems about living down here, about that changing from one culture to another, of kind of the importance of the soil and the agriculture and the sea, and it's really, really important to me. And some of my favorite poets are poets of place as well, really, really expressing their place.
I think it really grounds a piece too, if you can kind of locate it somewhere and talk about the physicality of the place. My last question for you: what do you think poems or any form of art can provide us?
Oof, wow.
Big question.
Big question, because there's a big answer, like so much. I think that firstly, to answer in terms of poetry, and then like in any form of art, like poetry can bring out the beauty of language, because I think beauty is a big thing in art, even if it's expressing something difficult or describing something that happens to be an ugly thing. Even if it's a poem of struggle against something terrible, there's something so crazy in the way that can be done. And the way it's done can be beautiful, and that's just astounding in certain circumstances. So in poetry, the beauty of language, and in other forms of art, the beauty of whatever the medium is that they're using. I think that I think the imagination is really, really important. We are imaginative beings and not just rational, and the rational part of us isn't the only way that we can grasp truth and explore new ideas. In fact, any new idea that we've ever come up with, even if it's a scientific idea, it first involved a leap of the imagination to kind of get there. And that's what I think, that the poetry can give words to that imagination, and sculpture can give shape to it, and paintings can give an image of it, and it can communicate what you can't quite express in a rational way yet. You can what you can just only apprehend, you can communicate through art, through poetry. So I think it brings out the beauty, it speaks and inspires the imagination, and everything else can flow from there, you know. Bring out the depths of relationship, can highlight the importance of the land. Any sort of important political or social issue can be communicated in a way that speaks to the heart through art and poetry. So yeah, so much in everywhere, every area of life, really.
Yeah, that's such a great answer, and I really like the part of imagination. I hadn't really thought about that too much. I think, I mean, I've spoken to a few artists, and they all have said that art can provide answers that might not become apparent in more rational thinking, such as the sciences or anything else. But yeah, I think art can, art requires a bit more imagination, thinking outside the box.
Yeah, absolutely.
And of course, I think people can appreciate the aesthetics and the beauty of any type of art, and with poems as well, kind of the visceral response that these works of art elicit.
Exactly.
So,
yeah.
Thank you for that response. Okay, is there anything else you wanted to add to this interview before we wrap up here?
Just want to say it's been an absolute pleasure from sending that first submission to Archetype to all the way through. The acceptance obviously is always wonderful news, but the editing process with yourself and all the communication has just been absolutely amazing. I think you guys you demonstrate you've got such the right priorities for a literary magazine to really want to bring out and work with the authors and the artists to bring out the best in the work, to really understand where their work is coming from, so you can present it in a way that honors their intention, but also brings out, leaves it open for reader interaction as well. I just think you really demonstrate that you've got such wonderful priorities, and it's been an absolute pleasure. And the interview as well, it's been really cool. So thank you.
Yeah, that means a lot to us. And yeah, we're just so thrilled that you're part of our inaugural issue. It's been really fun, but also there's a lot involved that's been involved in starting this up. So we're really excited to have you a part of it. And thank you for the kind words.
Do you want to say hello?
Hi.
Hello. It's Paula. Hello, Paula. Good night, Jeff.